So here you have a photograph of the Plymouth Synagogue. The oldest Ashkenazi synagogue in continuous use in the English-speaking world. That is normally the reaction. And it was indeed a hidden history until about 2007, 2008. And normally people say, well, we didn't know about it. Even though it's on a relatively easy street, most people walk down, it's just off Royal Parade, it's behind the Treasury Bar. People say, oh, I walk past that every day. But because it doesn't have a door leading onto the street to open it, it's faceless. It's like the mouth of it, the door is not there. And so people walk past and don't even consider it at all. So in 2013, I was doing a master's here at Plymouth University, and as part of my practice as research, I made a performance for the synagogue, where I spoke to all the ladies of the congregation, a very old, dying congregation. And the interviews that I recorded, I used verbatim as my text for the performance. But something also happened to me while I was researching in the synagogue. I found that the site started to speak to me and asking me to find a connection with it. And so I decided to research my own Jewish roots, which then 50% of the performance was about that search for my own Jewish roots, and 50% of the performance was about the Ladies' Guild, which is very similar to a Mothers' Union, or indeed a WI. And ever since I made that performance, I've performed it every year since during the Plymouth History Festival. And I think it's helped to raise awareness, not only of that site and the hiddenness of it, but the hiddenness of the whole culture. Because those people have gone unnoticed for many, many years. So when the synagogue custodian asked me to do a performance for the cemetery, which they were going to open for this year's History Festival, I jumped at the chance because it's even older than the synagogue. In 1740, it was the garden of a Mrs. Scherenbeck on the Hoe. And in those days, if a Jew passed over, they had to be shipped to London for burial. But if you were too geographically removed from London, it was perfectly acceptable to bury a Jew in the garden of another Jew. And this is what happened. And Mrs. Scherenbeck gave over her entire garden to the Hebrew congregation. And then when they filled that plot, they leased adjoining plot. And then when that got filled, they interred the bodies one on top of the other. And then when that got filled, they closed the door around 1872 and they locked it. And that's how it remained. So, how does one go about making a performance for a cemetery? I've worked with site for 10 years, and I know from experience now that you don't go in all guns blazing with an idea. You allow the site to speak to you. So we needed to go into the cemetery and listen to it and observe it and allow it to communicate with us as if it was our collaborator. So for the History Festival, we decided to trial something and gather feedback from the participants. And we decided to create half a dozen small biographies of people within the cemetery. And then we would record those biographies on MP3 players and place them on their graves so that people could just listen to them as they ambled around. This was really successful. And people said they were hungry for more. So the synagogue applied for the Vital Sparks funding that some of you would have heard about yesterday. And that meant we could pay a sound designer, and a gardener, and also buy equipment so that the synagogue could then recreate it every time they wanted to open the cemetery. The research was the most fascinating and equally frustrating. Some people were pre-census. Some had changed their names, which was a common occurrence. Some had travelled from parts of Europe that no longer existed, like parts of Prussia. And some, for all manner of reasons, were not on any records. But 2 ancestors came forward and allowed us to look at their family trees. So we thought it would be a nice touch if they wrote their own ancestors' biography. The main part of our research was a book written by one of the rabbis from the 1950s, Rabbi Bernard Susser. And he wrote a book called The Jews of Southwest England, The Rise and Decline of Their Medieval and Modern Communities. And it was published by Exeter University Press in 1993. And I think he was awarded a doctorate for it. I mean, years later, when we've now got the internet, we kept looking online at different ancestry websites. And he'd been there before us. In the years before internet or anything. So he was really, really thorough with his research. We found 2 murders, tales of bravery and heroism. So here you've got a silver snuff box awarded to Aaron Nathan, a Stonehouse constable, who apprehended a group of coiners, so people who were making counterfeit money. And he was awarded for his bravery with this snuff box. We found tales of plague, so the 1832 cholera epidemic. We found a tragic tale of a married couple who died within hours of each other and are both buried in unmarked graves within the cemetery. But the rather touching thing was that she wasn't Jewish, but she'd applied to be converted, and their children. So this was a couple who married out of wedlock and had children, but then wanted to convert the entire family. And she died before she was converted, but the congregation allowed her to be buried in the cemetery. And her daughter went on to become converted and marry a Jewish man, and they were the first married couple on the records of the synagogue. We also found tales of famine. So the same Aaron Nathan, who became a Stonehouse constable quite late in his life, earlier on in his life, we found a letter that he wrote to the synagogue asking for benevolence because he was down to his last farthing. He'd burnt most of his furniture to keep warm, and he couldn't afford to look after his 7 children. And indeed, we can't find any records of him even having 7 children. So we think some of them must have died of famine. We also have tales connected to royalty. So here we have the calling card of Abraham Joseph I, who was slopman to Prince William, the son of George III, who became king aged 67, the sailor king, and who the Royal William Yard is named after. But whilst he was a prince, he was the captain of a frigate called Pegasus that was here in Plymouth. And Abraham Joseph was his slopman being the accountant for the ship's accounts. And he became very wealthy. And his son, Joseph, went into the same profession. And his grandson, Abraham Joseph II, went into the same profession. Now, Abraham Joseph's daughter, Rose, married into a southwest Jewish family called the Solomons of Dawlish. And they had a large family, and their son moved to America to assimilate himself. He didn't want to be known coming from a Jewish family, so he changed his name to Simpson. And then he asked his son whether he'd like to remain in America or move back to Britain. And his son, Ernest Simpson, chose to come back to Britain with his American wife, who then left him for the Prince of Wales. So 6 generations after Abraham Joseph I, his great-great-granddaughter-in-law brought down the throne of England. But for all these amazing stories, we also noted that there were many just very ordinary lives. And just as important, because this cemetery shows life in all its guises, but mostly in the everyday. People just getting on with their lives and assimilating themselves, whilst at the same time being true to their faith and culture without flaunting it. And it was this aspect that we felt had a relevance to today. Jews were expelled from England in the 13th century and allowed to return in 1656. And by 1725, there were small pockets of Jewish communities all around the southwest. So this cemetery contains some of the first wave of immigrants who returned. They came to England for a better life. Some were fleeing persecution. And in the 18th century, Jewish immigrants stayed in Plymouth and the southwest because of religious tolerance. Rabbi Susa says on the sleeve note of his book, "This book describes in detail the integration of a foreign ethnic minority into the mainstream of English life without entirely losing its distinctive characteristics. And we can see today, from these hidden buried lives, how the stories from one small community can illustrate how much they gave back to their adopted home." Just a note on how curious people were about this hidden history. We opened the cemetery for 1 hour a day over 3 days, armed with 15 MP3 players, because we didn't expect many people to come, partly because it really is hidden, and partly because the event we were part of had given the wrong postcode, so we thought people wouldn't turn up anyway. But local news took an interest, and we went on the Radio Devon Breakfast Show, and then Spotlight did a spot, and that helped to bring over 400 people through the door. And it didn't just interest people of a certain age. We had entire families coming, or father with his son who was going to study history at A-level. We had people who lived locally who'd walked past countless times and always wanted to know what was behind the door. We had neighbours who could see the graveyard from their rooms in their house. Many had no connection at all, but enjoyed the audio installation that revealed the hidden history, not just of a site, but of a community of people. And I think it illustrates how the arts can play a major role in sharing social histories. We were vastly unprepared for the amount of people, but we had uploaded the stories onto SoundCloud, and we were able to get people to listen on their phones. And for the audios online, over the same 3 days, we had 1,500 hits. So, you can hear those audios. If you go to rippletheatreco.com, there's a link on that. And also, if you click on audio performances, you get all the more information about who we worked with, the people who were part of the project. And also, it gives you the details of how to book a cemetery tour. So unless it's part of the History Festival, the only way you can do it is by asking the cemetery, the synagogue themselves. And you need to ask the synagogue custodian, Jerry Sibley. Although, if you want to do it around this time of year, he's more than likely not going to take you with an MP3 player to it. He's going to show you it and then take you back to the vestry where he'll feed you tea and kosher cake, and then you listen to them in the vestry. So what I would say is, if you're really interested, hang fire till May, when we're going to be opening it again in the History Festival, and we are going to do it as we intended, which was so people could stand on the bones of the people they are listening to. I've probably got a little bit more time, haven't I? So, this is some of the feedback that we had. People arrived and they had to wait. Some people waited over an hour to get an MP3 player, but we didn't have one single complaint. I think they were just so excited to be somewhere they'd never been before. Oh, so here are some of my tips, I suppose. I like to try, because I've been working with site for a while, and that site always comes with a community, and a community who aren't necessarily arts-based people. I always find it really helpful to identify somebody who I can communicate with first, who understands where I'm coming from, and then he can then introduce me to somebody else, and then they can introduce me to somebody else. I'm told it's called a snowballing technique. Assume the community know more than you do. Sometimes I have an idea. So when I did the show in the synagogue, I didn't have an idea of what I was going to do. I didn't have an idea that I was actually going to research my own Jewish heritage. That came after sitting in the building for quite some time. So don't just parachute in. Ask the community to share their stories, because they'll be very proud of their stories and very proud of their site. And lastly, something that somebody told me right at the beginning, and I've always stuck by it, is that if you're asking people for their memories and stories, don't leave anybody in a vulnerable position at the end of it, because memories can throw up lots of emotions. I found that very, very important. Especially if there's a group of people together and they just start talking and things come out, and sometimes they're just thrown into a memory that they'd totally forgotten or pushed aside. So those are my tips.